What is up, y'all? It's your boy Aniki coming at you with another video. This time on My Hero Academia Chapter 353 review, but I will also be covering 352 because I didn't give you a review last week. I'm not going to do this as page by page in theory, but I should be able to give you guys a thorough breakdown of this chapter and the last one. No problems. Of course, if you did miss that, I apologize. Ended up having a rather busy week, but all the same, let's get right into chapter 352, especially because that opened up with that Shoto flashback. So I do want to lead with this stuff just because I want to talk about Shoto's character and how that kind of plays into his connections, especially since what he says during this, during 352 kind of plays into when he's talking about how Class 1A motivated him, encouraged him, and they didn't really leave people behind. And it's worth noting that it's specifically one of the least appreciated arcs in the series, being Provisional License, that sets up him having this understanding finally, because when the rest of 1A passes the Provisional License exam, they do it together. They work together, they consistently focus on cooperation, and it's important to note that while the scene where he tells Deku, "This is my power, thank you," that comes before he fights Dabi and uses that move a couple times and starts to explain, they never left me behind, blah, blah, blah. And the reason for this being is that this is the introduction to the icy flame. This is what makes him icy hot. This is the true representation of his power, having this access to both types of fire, with the cold flame, with hot flame. I'm hoping to eventually see hot ice, just because if we can convert his power and flip its purpose, then with it also regulating the circulatory system, then in theory, Shoto having the potential to grow somewhere where he generates a solid mass of ice, but instead it's just like a giant heat block, is something that could potentially be in the works, or him just straight up being able to launch scalding water, stuff like that. Or just being able to even consistently output steam, or just give him some variety now, because once we have this cold flame, I feel like we have to answer what's coming on the other side, as far as what he can utilize with fire on the fire side, using his ice instead, or if that's just not possible and this is just a specific niche manifestation of his power. Since the X goes across both, you could argue that this cold flame is just the final manifestation of his power, a fiery chill. Either way works. So talking about why Endeavor, and one of the things that I do want to talk about here also is that when he talks about his heart, and then there's a bar that goes straight down, and it may just be coincidental, but it's nice to have it kind of split his left and right one last time, as he talks about this is what my dad's agenda was, this is what I'm doing, just from an artistic standpoint, and then to follow that up with him thanking Midoriya, and that being that shot that's just his face, and the X is gone, and it's just him, and him thanking him, showing that it's his power, the power that Midoriya was always telling him he had since Sports Festival. So cool there, cool not there. Way to tie his connection with Deku in, and it's worth noting that his acknowledgement of Class 1A is important too, because even after Deku convinced him that it was his power, it's not like he became a better team player. That required he was willing to submit to Momo specifically, but again, he leaves him behind in Provisional License, doesn't try to work with Anasa right away, and that lack of cooperation is what he ends up thinking about as he's fighting, and thinking about how these sidekicks are working for him, and that's part of why 1A comes up when they do. He's thinking about the ways in which these people are putting it on the line for them, and the ways in which he could have been neglected in his life and wasn't, and how he's going to repay back that favor ultimately by trying to take down Dabi here. This is also with that whole Mount Lady flashback and what he's about, what does he want to be, and when you also think back to the remedial course arc, where he was using his flame to warm the kids up after the slide, and them being cold from being on an ice slide. It's very clear that Shoto wants to be a flame that assures people, both providing warmth and cold. Basically, the flame that people need is what he wants to be, and I think that's really cool. Just a good way to translate his power into a way to convert that half hot, half cold, a power about division, a power that focuses kind of on separation and resentment, and ultimately the true power that manifests out of this ability that seems so divisive is one that unites two very different extremes and combines them into one medium. So just allowing Shoto to be a guy that does have that potential and reaches out, and again combine those powers into that one medium, combining that hot, combining that cold, contradicting the premise of that whole half hot, half cold, uniting it as one, finally showing that there's also some sort of peace and semblance within Shoto's heart, with it being him also slowly making peace with the bloodline ties that he has, with that being the crux of the technique, chilling blood and heating blood and sending it between different sections of his body. Really just whole, like, chapter 352 is just symbols on symbols on symbols, while simultaneously also advancing what is one of the best choreographed fights, as far as the sequence where the Icebound Crash, Cold Flames Pale Blade knocks Dabi back and he stabilizes only to turn that into a setting position. The art in 352 was insane from the standpoint of genuinely you had pieces of flesh carbonizing and breaking off of Dabi's body mid-combat. And that kind of does, this is where I'm going to start segueing into what we were talking about in 353, especially because as Dabi does start to acknowledge Shoto and he does take on this battle and he has made peace with dying, Shoto seems to have denied him that death here. Because it seems that Shoto has completely extinguished his flames. His body temperature should be low enough where it's not like he's going to go into fever and lose a bunch of brain cells. Right now, Dabi probably can live. But there's one very specific thing that I do want to highlight here, which is that Dabi's hands and feet are frozen, but specifically the way his hands seem to be frozen kind of suggests that ice is like on top of where those muscles, where he was losing muscle. And before I get into that, with that, I want to go into this next chapter because, one, we got the color page, and the color page kind of solidified like what Shoto's powers looked like, and of course the ice and stuff, but also the news of Dabi being down and what that meant for the army, both armies, is critical, because the way a lot of people interpreted it, they were like, hey, we have a reason to have hope. And if you think about it, a lot of them were fighting the Nomu. When Dabi was launching all these big attacks, I was wondering about that. Like, I hadn't seen a lot of villains with him. He just kind of seemed to be going off, and like we really centered on him, and like we knew that Nomu was there, but we hadn't gotten a whole lot of what was going on here. So we see that the Nomu is still up. The rest of the villains that had gotten transported with Dabi, it seems that like they didn't get any of the heavy hitters. They specifically mentioned like Kuneda and Gashly. Now, I want to talk about Gashly for a bit because it was specifically Shad's manga who brought up that Gashly is from a tale where lots of children die. And specifically, it's a book that teaches the alphabet is one of the ones that I think he referenced. But essentially, Gashly being from what seems to be from a fairy tale and a character that revolves around the death of children, I fully do expect him to come into play. At which site, that's a whole other thing. But we've had people fully willing to exploit children throughout the series, so the idea of him potentially killing children, utilizing their corpses, or anything like that should not be off the table, especially because the villains are allowed to be as heinous as they need to be as far as quirks are concerned. So Gashly, to me, is just a Chekhov's gun here. We will be meeting Gashly, especially since Kuneda is introduced this chapter. All Might being the one to pass the news around that Dabi is the one Dabi has fallen is critical, because it's the voice of the guy who led the civilization, who has been, pioneering or pushing them forward, making them feel encouraged, making them feel safe. So All Might specifically giving the news is necessary, because it's the rock that should have faltered but stands tall like Gibraltar, giving them the good news and keeping them fighting even when he is physically handicapped. Now, focusing in on also, though, well, actually, before I even get into that, just going through the chapter more, getting some answers about how they decided to approach certain topics or specific, like, elephants in the room, or in this case, the Gigantomachia in the manga. And we get confirmation that they expected the villains to have an offshoot force, and they had already stationed some of the kids there. And Mount Lady, it's worth noting that while a lot of people were probably more hung up over Mount Lady's failings or situations that didn't go ideally for her, she is, as of the last pro hero chart, like the 23rd ranked hero. Obviously, we can argue that that's primarily about, she's with Edshot. But her and Kami Woods were both relatively new or in the opening stages of having their own agencies at the start of the series. So from the course of about a year to 2 years throughout being introduced to Kamui Woods and Mount Lady, she's gone from being a newbie to top 50 heroes in the country. That's still something that I would say is probably worth noting and acknowledging. Now, with the return of Gas Mask and the emphasis of Mina in these shots, we have a matchup already kind of set up. And what's more is we have Red Riot on the scene, so we have more than just Mina. We get Pinky and Red, and I think Hori was being very deliberate to say, like, hey, look, notice they're both red, they're both colors, they're both shades of red. Which if this is partially Hori setting up his pairing like some people think, then I'm just going to assume that they're going to have a child named Magenta or Scarlet or something like that. Now, what I like about this too is that Kirishima, being somebody who has been stated to be a person of that lifts morale back throughout the series before Kind, him being the one to talk about how, yeah, we got to stay strong, we got to do this. Todoroki, that's so in character. It's him playing into that role, but then also getting to see that morale booster in real time that he was supposed to be lauded for. You know, actually seeing him cheer people up, get them excited, ready to go and fight. That's what we want. So now, regardless of whatever Class 1B or Mina's doing, I promise you this: I fully expect Mina to get to confront, as Coyote has called him, Gas Mask God. Only other thing that I want to point out with that character too is that, one, he seems to be leading the battalion, which makes sense because he was a leader of one of the regiments. Two, he does have Feel Good Inc. software, which means that even if certain radio and different forms of communication are down, the Feel Good Inc. satellites are still up, which is especially surprising considering. But at the end of the day, they're in space, so what's the government going to do? Launch a rocket up there just to find your satellites and disable them? Not happening. Especially not given the context of everything that's happened over the past month. They just don't have the time for it, the resources, anything. So that fight's coming. Now, what I will say, and that I do like about this, is that by showing us Mina again, while they're happy and celebrating, we immediately get to think back to Mina talking about how Midnight had more to teach them and everything was going to be fine. So this feels like a giant red flag being placed in the center of the chapter to say, don't you think this is a little too happy-go-lucky? Remember when she got excited last time? Which the Sero and Sato scene with Ojiro in the background, of course, does seem to emphasize even further for me, because when he goes, we'll have to celebrate, and Ojiro's like, yeah, haha, people doubted Shoto. This seems like it could be, oh yeah, no, we're just happy, things are going well. We know that some people out of the series would have doubted Shoto being able to handle it. We know that some people within the story would have doubted Shoto being able to handle it. Totally rational line to say, but the look that Sero gives in his mask, that ... I don't think he's going to be some kind of traitor or anything like that. At least I'm hoping not. I know that Sero's planned to have some big moments. So from that point, I kind of don't see why Sero would do that ... or like we would have that scene if we weren't getting something a little shakier. Even us stopping by up in the sky, we see that the UA has left coastal Japan, or at the very least it is over some body of water now, which leads me to believe that they are slowly directing the UA fortress towards Deku, so that now Deku is moving towards them and they are moving towards Deku. I thought initially that we were going to get the UA to compare to the Tokyo thing, just like in Akira, but it seems that we may be heading more towards a direction where they have a giant battle at sea. Now, the upside to that is that it could create an environment where characters, like, one, we have Bakugo here, and we have Shigaraki, but like Shigaraki's not going to sit around decaying everything if when we get to this point they're out in the middle of the ocean, so stuff's going to get to stand. Anything that's floating will be able to be used as a surface. What's more though is that with Horikoshi saying that he has plans for Bakugo, with Bakugo saying didn't expect any less from you, Todoroki, instead of calling him Icy Hot or Half and Half or anything like that, put in that pure respect on his name, acknowledging that he's actually finally Shoto's friend and that he had high expectations of him, even if he told him, which we all need to keep in the back of our minds, that he told Shoto that he would last longer than him in a fight when the Cold Flame was introduced, and that he's been working on his stamina since the month before, or for weeks before this had been happening. He had already kind of figured out cluster and was working with that. So I'm expecting for Bakugo, especially Bakugo with this cluster and out at sea, because we remember when Endeavor had Hawks take him out in the sky, he didn't have to hold back. if Bakugo and this barrier at UA, if this barrier at UA especially fails, Bakugo getting to just throw out giant explosions without having to worry about, oh, if I blow up this building, it's gonna no, none of that. If this thing goes down and he has to fight and he starts wiping, and Shiggy really does start taking out different members of the forces, then this is the perfect chance for Bakugo to go ahead and give it his all. Now, one of the things worth noting is that Kuneda himself seems to, we get introduced to Kuneda. Let me start that over. One of the things worth, okay, so we meet Kuneda. Now that we meet Kuneda, who we had heard about earlier this chapter, he starts talking about the matchup between him and Fat Gum. In addition to that, he's one of those people who's talking about the planet. I assume that this is supposed to be that he's, one, an assassin, but two, he's likely an environmental terrorist, but one that does terrorism for the environment is kind of what I'm wagering here, just because he's got the dreads and it kind of seems like he's playing into like a hippie assassin almost. From the way he's dressed to the borderline what looks like almost carpeting on his shoulders. So yeah. And he's got the dreadlocks, which a lot of people associate with hippie culture, especially because of what happened in the 70s and stuff, and the 60s. So, and also his focus on the planet, like I said. But now, some people are confused because of this comment about Dictator's failure. This is in reference to the fact that different assassins were running into Deku, and Dictator fighting Deku led to Class A finding him, which led to Deku going back in, so Kaneda never went out to find him. This also suggests that All For One was monitoring the assassins pretty well and was actually deliberately sending them out one at a time so that he wasn't spending too many resources on assassins while still keeping some of his good fighters. So we have a Tartarus escapee here who, because of the fact that Deku went back home, never got sent out. Now, his ability seems to have something to do with making lots of spider lilies, which are supposed to be extremely poisonous. And we even see that Fat Gum has some either protruding from him or sprouting out of him. My personal stance is that these are protruding from him because they've been thrown into him. Specifically because if flowers and stuff are just grow out of the things that he's supposed to be killing, then it wouldn't make sense for Fat Gum to be the only one with flowers. What this looks like, especially when you look at the positioning of Fat Gum is technically standing directly in front of Aoyama, is that Kuneda threw flowers at them and Fat Gum body blocked it, and this is a bad matchup for Fat Gum. The thing that's going to keep him alive for at least a while is going to be that he is a big dude, and that's going to make it where it's going to take more dosages of this poison, if that's what we're playing with, of this flower being poisonous, to kill him. So that body weight is actually going to be, it's going to basically going to be can you get a high enough dosage in me before I can take you down? If you guys have watched or read the 1,000-Year Blood War and Bleach, this kind of reminds me of D the Drug from the Vandrik, but we'll see. Now, what Koneda also brings up is how realistically Aoyama is never going to be free. He's not getting off. He's probably going to go to prison. At the end of the day, he still worked for All For One. He's not totally getting off scot-free. And even if he was getting off scot-free on the hero side, he's not getting off scot-free with All For One and All For One subordinates, because he will be known as the guy who led to the fall of All For One. So no matter what, Aoyama spends the rest of his life at odds. And this is what he means by when he calls him the Bat of Aesop, because the Bat of Aesop is from Aesop's fables, where there's a war of beasts and birds. And because, as we all know, bats are mammals, they technically fit the order of beast. But because bats fly, many people immediately assume that they're birds. And because the bat was rejected by the beast for being a bird and the birds for being a beast, when the war was resolved, he was said to have no place because he was never truly one or the other. The goal, my hope, is that vigilantism becomes a bit more common post this anyway. And because Aoyama will have earned a license, as long as that's not revoked, he would technically be allowed to operate as a vigilante. That's what I would like to see happen, especially because then you finally canonically acknowledge and create a space for more gray between these characters. There's gray in the story that's written in there, obviously, but I'm talking about within the story creating a system that actually acknowledges the gray and lets vigilantes kind of be more of a thing, especially since a lot of people would not feel comfortable with Aoyama being a hero if they understood his past in official capacity. But just because people aren't trying to give you a government-sponsored position to make money as a hero doesn't mean you don't use that license and help people. So we'll see how that goes, or which direction we're going here. Now, what I really want to talk about is why Dabi falling is kind of important, because Dabi is, as you know, All For One said, one of the boys born with everything. They talked about how he had cracks or evil within him the entire time, and one of the best quirks for it. Now, when I talk about whether or not Shoto took Dabi down, it's specifically Spinner, who has been kind of hidden from us, and we still don't have 100% confirmation on where he is, but we do know that he almost killed Koda because that bum needed to be saved by Shoji. As usual, Koda dragging people down. What's worth noting, though, is that Shoto's victory should bolster the morale for the heroes, but in turn, what Spinner does is he calls it information warfare. He says that dude has all the convictions in the world. We even get back to the day that Spinner took that extra quirk from All For One so that he could go ahead and do this battle. He straight up says his convictions could never fail him. He admits that he was faking it until he make it. He admits that he never had the proper convictions that Dabi had. To a certain degree, what Spinner is kind of acknowledging here is that part of him looked up to Dabi. Dabi is partially a role model for Spinner. And Spinner is the one who's been the most invested in caring about the heart of the league and wanting people to actually care about each other. Didn't want to lose Toga, wanted her to make sure she came back, everything. So we're getting to understand how Spinner views Dabi just off this one page like that. Now, we see that Spinner is leading the Kurogiri response team, which should mean that they're at Central Hospital. But we also don't know if for some reason Kurogiri's been moved or not, so I don't want to just say they're at Central Hospital. I'm hoping that he's just at Central Hospital and I'm just misremembering. In fact, screw it. I'm going to do what I do when I can't fully remember if I am remembering right or not. Let's see, the start of the war. Okay. Refresh. Nope. Nope. All right. Okay, so yes. Okay. So, looked into it more. All Might is likely at Central Hospital. Kurogiri is likely in Central Hospital as well. So the raid that Spinner is leading is likely on Central Hospital. Now, what this also does is open the door for, of all people, Spinner to be the one to kill All Might, which I had not thought about until now. So we now live in this world where it's possible for Spinner to be the one to kill All Might. It's possible that they actually succeed in this raid on Central Hospital. We don't 100% know who the Central Hospital protection team is. The only person we've seen really be there is Shoji, and if we get a full-blown raid, depending on how many officers are there, Now, we get to the Ida and Shoto part where they're talking about how Shoto accidentally froze out his engines, and Ida gives him that bit of support and asks how Dabi is still alive in the state that he's in. Now, I can't tell if this is supposed to be like Mirio actually wearing his helmet or just some random dude. Probably just some random dude. No. So then this random dude is there to help him kind of handle Dabi's body, so to speak. I don't want to, that's not exactly the right phrasing, but you see Dabi starting to pass out and there's somebody holding him up. But then we get this glow. And this glow is at Dabi's heart. Now, I don't want to jump the gun, but there's been a couple of popular theories out there from things like Dabi's going to have the Phoenix Flame to Dabi will have his body's fire will resurrect him and all these other things. But we know that Dabi's not going to sit here and get a bunch of damage from Frostbite, obviously, because he's got raised constitution. But this begs an important question. Could Shoto hitting Dabi with all this ice this way finally be unlocking some more of Dabi's power? Because while the Phoenix Flame is popular, I have heard and seen somebody once mention, though I cannot remember where now, they floated this idea that what if Dabi had ice inside this about now what that would do is essentially give him the ability to like generate ice and cold within his body so that he can stop himself from overheating, but I don't think that would protect him from the damages of having you know, the outside of his external, you know, still ultimately damaged. Like that ice layer, even if you like put a bunch of ice inside of you, the most you're doing is reserving your innards. But now with him being frozen, with his heart pumping, could it be that now that we know that with the way that Dabi or the way that Shoto was manipulating his icy fire and manipulating that, the cold flame, we know that his blood and pumping that back and forth through. So what if Dabi, by having that ice placed upon his wrist, by having that sealed, is starting to pump blood, and we know that he was given a bunch of regenerative tissue. So what if that regenerative tissue that was used to restore his body, combined with this ice, combined with the oddities within his physician, allowed him to finally start circulating with that cold blood, and he was basically able to start using his fire while protecting himself, coating himself in ice. The same way that so that the ice attacks wouldn't work on him and the fire attacks aren't going to work because they're both throwing out big fire or whatever, basically making it where it's going to come down to who wants it more, who can land these real blows. I don't think Dabi can be done here, and the reason why I feel that we have something more to come out of this with Dabi having that glowing heart is because of the chapter's name. This chapter was named Endeavor, and we only really focused on him at the very end when it was announced that Dabi had lost and Shoto had won, and he was standing there looking confused and shocked, and All For One is basically already getting inside of his head, and you've got Bruce Wayne, you got Endeavor's Robin right here on the scene in Hawks, basically trying to get him to recognize he doesn't need to be focused on that. He doesn't need to be listening to the talk. He needs to focus on winning. But to endeavor, what does it mean to endeavor? To endeavor is to persevere. It's to keep trying. Shoto kept trying to become a better person. He kept going. But when we saw Endeavor, the person who has been described as the most stubborn hero, we saw it when Dabi's heart was glowing. Dabi who hasn't gotten to show him anything. Dabi who wanted to show him stuff when he was little. That idea of Dabi not getting to properly show his dad anything has come up multiple times to the extent where I almost feel like we're obligated to get more out of the story, and it has to connect back into the All For One battlefield. Everybody endeavoring and persevering through. Yes, the Nomu is likely going to be taken down. That's not that important. What will be important is knowing that Endeavor's DNA, that the blood that runs through his veins and runs through Toya's flames, is going to keep him motivated. We cracked open the door to start a lot of different battles, and Dabi could just be finished. He could just be put in a pack and wrapped and done. But I'm not going to assume that. Instead, I'll just acknowledge that there's a chance that whatever's going on here is going to have something to do with his real quirk. And it's worth noting that this heart, this origin, this center, everybody's supposed to remember their origin. Remember where they came from. We got that image of both young Dabi and young Toya, or young Shoto and young Toya. So when we're getting these young images, we're getting this focus on origin. We had Shoto kind of acknowledge his origin and focus on that. And we had Dabi talk about his origin a little, like what was going on. But we still don't know what was happening between 16 and 24. And that kind of has to come into play. So I'm really hoping that, well, I'm not really hoping. I just think it would be really interesting, ultimately, if this ice attack set off a catalyst in Dabi that caused him to realize another utilization of his power that he had never thought of before. Because at the end of the day, one of the things that keeps being brought up is how all Endeavor did was tell him how to turn up the heat. It's time for him to learn from somebody else or from his experiences and give himself something different, even if he still dies or fails in the end. So those are my thoughts on ultimately My Hero 352 and 353. Let me know what you guys are thinking down below, especially because I think that Spinner, like a lot of this stuff is going to really pop off in a direction, and it feels way too early within this story beat, especially for Dabi and Shoto to be resolved, when realistically, like, there's just a lot more that can happen. And with these opening introductions of Kunita and Gashley, it just kind of seems like we're setting up to be going on for a way longer journey than Horikoshi intended, and that's okay. I'm not going to worry about the MHA ending rumors, and I encourage you not to worry about it either until we actually get closer along, closer to the end. So, in either way, I'll be here with you. So I hope to see you guys for the Church of MHA. I'm Anaki, and I am out.